Well, good morning. Welcome each one. Welcome the visitors. It's been very good to be here. Thank you, Ken, for those songs. Lord, I am fondly, earnestly longing. I think that could be each one of our desires. And thank you, Sean, for that devotion. I don't think I knew it said that God, I thought I had it. I just need to turn to that. Psalms 31. Plentifully rewardeth the proud doer. I'd love to hear what each one of you think that is. And that's my title of the message is eternal rewards. I didn't know it said that in there. It says plentifully rewardeth the proud doer. And God is a God of rewards. We might think sometimes we get that confused with works. But we'll as we go into the message, that God is a God of rewards. There's many rewards that the Bible talks about. And thank you, Jeff, for that testimony. I really appreciated that, your testimony of surrender and over to God. I can testify of that too. And one reason why I surrender is because God, in those promises, He knows what He's talking about. And we can rest assured that God knows, and Jesus, what He says is true. For a text, let's turn to Matthew 6. Like I said, the title is Eternal Rewards. We're going to read, this is part of the Sermon on the Mount. Here, we're going to start in verse 19 of chapter 6, and we're going to back up in the chapter a little later on, but it says in Matthew 6, verse 19, it says, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through or steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." I'm going to read that also, 19 through 21 in the NLT. It says, Don't store up treasures here on earth, where moths eat them and rust destroy them, and where thieves break in and steal. Store your treasures in heaven, where moth and rust cannot destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. Where your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will be also. Here we can kind of put a negative spin on these verses. What is Jesus actually talking here? He's talking to a crowd of people here. In the old way of doing life back in their time, the king, they didn't have banks, they didn't have bank accounts like we have today. It was kind of more, you could say, like a communist. The king would take the treasures, take the wealth of the land, and put them in a safe and would guard them heavily. And we can know throughout all the scriptures that when another nation would become more powerful, he would conquer that nation, take that wealth. So that is what he's talking about. Jesus is comparing that treasure to that, of this wealth. And first of all, we know that way back in the Old Testament, that was not God's will for the children of Israel to have a king and to do this and to take the treasures. And like when they took the golden cups. But anyways, that's a whole nother deal. But that's what he's talking about, is this treasure, this earthly treasure, where the enemies could break through and steal. But he says, lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust is corrupt. And that's what we want to focus on, laying up treasures. We could ask the question, well, how do we lay up treasures in heaven? how do we do that? And I don't have all the answers, and that's between you and God, laying up treasures in heaven. Like I said, laying up treasures in heaven creates a reward, and God is a God of rewards. So as we go back previously in chapter 6, it talks a little bit about laying up treasures in heaven and how things are done. And in the first couple verses of chapter 6, it talks about giving. In verse 4, it says, "Therefore thine alms may be in secret, and that thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly." There we can see an example of laying up treasures in heaven. And as we go on down into chapter 6, then he talks about praying, he talks about fasting. In verse 17 it says, "But thou, when thou fastest, anoint thine head and wash thy face, that thou appear not unto man to fast, but unto thy Father which is in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly." Like I said, God is a God of rewards, and God sees everything. We'll get into more scriptures that God notices things. He's a Father that seeth in secret and will reward us openly. So as we think of laying up treasures in heaven, as we think of the reward, we don't come up with the reward. God comes up with the reward. And when we stack treasures in heaven, God, that's between us and God. And it's a promise, because it's what he says. It says, many people have been, this treasure that's in us, that's in our heart, many people's been disappointed in life because a thief broke through and stealed it away. But if a promise we have, when we lay up treasures in heaven, no moth, no rust is corrupt, and where thieves cannot break through and steal it. And then it goes on in verse 28, "For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." That's just a statement, that's a fact. And like I said before, let's not get that confused. And in Ephesians 2, verse 8, it says, "For by grace are ye saved through faith, not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast." Then it goes on to say, it says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them." And in Luke 18, verse 9, we're gonna here's a familiar story of putting treasure in heaven and where our treasure is. In verse 9 of Luke 18, "And he spake this parable unto a certain this group of people," it says, "which trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others." Jesus was talking to this group of people here. It says that they trusted in themselves and that they were righteous and despised others. And it goes on to say, it kind of makes sense of why Jesus would say what he says. "Two men went up in the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, idolaters, or even this publican. I fast twice in the week. I give tithes of all that I possess. The publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much his eyes into heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful unto me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone that exalteth himself shall be abased, and he that humbleth himself shall be exalted." So we have an example of two men of where they were establishing their treasure. I have a little story here I'm going to read, and I'm pretty sure it's been shared here, but I'm just going to read it again. I like how it brings out the point of Ephesians 2, like we read, for by grace are we saved, not of works, lest any man boast. And it goes on to say, we as workmanship created unto good works. It says, we've come through another series of exciting sporting events of a World Series baseball, one claiming the title of America's greatest sport, still held by many. Thousands love to watch two teams battle for the title. There is one great story of this event we need to remember. In 1924, the World Series, the New York Giants and the Washington Senators were tied after 6 games. Griffin Stadium in Washington was packed for the final game on October 10, 1924. At the beginning of the 9th inning, the score was tied at 3 runs each. New York didn't score any runs, and Washington came to bat. The home team fans screamed for one lone run, which would win the series and the World Championship for the Senators. The first 2 men made outs, and it looked like there would be extra innings. Then a player named Leon, his nickname was Gooseland, came to the plate. 2 strikes were called, and then 2 balls. The crowd was watching every pitch. On the 5th pitch, Gooseland stepped into the bat and slammed it to the left center field. The crowd became delirious. It looked like a home run, but it hit inches below the top of the wall and fell back into the field of play. Gooseland was running around the bases, slowing down for a triple when the third base coach waved him on to try for an in-park home run. The shortstop took the peg from left center and fired the ball to the catcher. Gooseland slid into the home plate in a cloud of dust, seemingly a split second before the tag. The catcher followed the routine of throwing the ball around the bases just in case while waiting for the umpire to make the call. The umpire delayed his call. After consulting with the other umpires, he cried, "You're out." Washington player, the manager, Bucky Harris, along with his team and fans, rushed into the field protesting the call. The umpire secured order and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, the batter is out, not because he didn't beat the ball at home plate, because he didn't touch first base." The players were always required to touch each base with their foot as they rounded the base, and the player didn't do this. The game went into extra innings. In the bottom of the 12th inning, Early McNeil hit an infield ground ball that should have been an easy out. The ball took a bounce over the third baseman's glove into left field. That was enough to score Washington catcher Rule from third base with the winning run. It was the first World Series championship Washington won. What a World Series. So here we have the example of a baseball game, and he said this, so we can take this as a spiritual example. He said that the first base represents salvation, second base represents baptism in church, and the third base stood for Christian service, and home plate was heaven. He said, you can think you're doing all the right things and believe you're sliding into home plate just ahead of the catcher receiving the ball. You're safe. The game is won. Identification and baptism and church memberships and outreach service through evangelism with third base are important and wonderful, but reaching home plate will not be what it is except if salvation first base has not been touched. Getting up to bat, hitting the ball, and running the bases won't count if you miss first base. We may look like we have made it home, but the umpire who sees it all and knows we must play by the rules will call us out. And there's a saying, it says, "Fear not, your life shall have an ending. Rather fear it shall never have a beginning." And that is first base, and that is salvation. So that's one thing that as we think of these rewards, they're not participation rewards. Like, it seems like so easy today. You know, you hand out rewards, or kind of this idea that I deserve it. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a God is a God of rewards, like in the devotion is he plentifully rewardeth the proud doer. But as we think of Christians, as we think of setting up treasures in heaven, there's many verses that God will come back with rewards. You know, while we're living on this earth, you know, and when Jesus says, when he talks about these treasures, he's not devaluing treasures. He's not devaluing the things we have. He's not devaluing, you know, enjoyment in them. He's just saying the reality of what it is. One day everything's going to be burnt up, and it'd be sad if we don't store up treasures in heaven. You know, sometimes while we're in the busyness of life, you know, sometimes our treasures are not very evident. You know, we can hide. I mean, usually a treasure is buried. Usually we don't really know what someone's treasure is. But God can bring things in our lives and hard things and stuff to show us what our treasure is, and only God can do that. I want to look in Revelations 22, I think we're going to turn to Philippians 4. Some of these verses you don't have to turn to. Like I said, God is a God of rewards. Even Paul recognized this in Philippians 4, 15. It says, "Now you Philippians know also that in the beginning of the gospel, when I departed from Macedonia, no church communicated with me as concerning giving and receiving, but ye only." He's commending the Philippians that when I came to you, nobody, which is, and as we go on, he said, that's fine. "For even the Thessalonica ye sent once and again out of necessity. Not that I desire a gift," not that he wanted gifts from them, is why he's bringing this out. He says, "But I desire fruit that may abound to your account." That he's saying if they give him, he's thanking them for giving him, say, money or whatever they would have gave him, and he's but I desire that fruit may abound to your account. And I don't know how God keeps track of these rewards or how it's all done, but Paul states that he's thankful that, like, that's why he's not because he desires a gift, but he wants God to bless them through their giving, through this account. And I don't know how God has it all set up when we store treasures in heaven. In Revelations 22, verse 12, it says, "Behold, I come quickly, and my reward is with me, to give every man according to his work, what his work shall be." In Luke 6, verse 22, it says, "Blessed are ye when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice ye in that day, and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. For in like manner did their fathers unto the prophets." In 2 Timothy 4, verse 8, it says, Paul says, "I have fought a good fight, I have finished my course, I have kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, not to me only, but unto all them also that love his appearing." And in Matthew 10, I'm going to read start in verse 41. He that receiveth a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward, and he that receiveth a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whosoever shall give a drink unto one of these little ones a cup of cold water, only in the name of a disciple, verily I say unto you, he shall no wise lose his reward. And another promise we can see earlier in that chapter, in verse 30, it says, But the very hairs of your head are numbered. Fear ye not, therefore. Ye are more value than many sparrows. Whosoever therefore shall confess me before men, him will I confess also before my Father which is in heaven. God is a God of rewards. And He is ready and willing to bless us. And so we think of I want to turn to John 14 yet, talking about rewards, a very familiar passage. It says, Let not your heart be troubled. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. And whither I go ye know, and the way ye know. Thus saith unto Thomas, Lord, we know not whither thou goest, and how can we know the way? Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. As we think of laying treasures up in heaven, and none of us has never been there yet. So as we think of, suppose you're going into another country and you can't take anything with you. You're going overseas, you can't take anything with you, but you could send stuff ahead of time. I think this is kind of what he's talking about here. So you think you would, I don't know what you would send. I'd probably try to make sure there's coffee sent somewhere there. But you get the point. We can't take anything with us, but we lay up treasures in heaven. And I had to think of Melvin's message last Sunday when the children. Is everything okay? Is everything going to be all right? Okay. Well, let's have a word of prayer. Maybe then we'll just keep going. Dear God, let's be with Miranda right now, God. Just the need is, God, just thank you for your sovereignty and your guidance. Just give her peace, give her joy. In Jesus' name, amen. Like we was talking about putting our treasure in heaven, going to another country, sending things, doing things before we get there. When we invest in eternity, we won't have to worry. I think I mentioned this, but I think I'll, like I said, Melvin's message last Sunday, we think of the children stood and the thunder and the excitement that happened in heaven. That is put in, when we confess, like our Sunday school was talking about, that is putting a treasure up in heaven. The Bible talks about giving someone a glass of cold water. The reward will not be forgotten. And if we serve a God that even knows the hairs on our head, he pays attention to that. He pays attention to that. And he knows, he plentifully, that thought was a challenge to me, he plentifully knows how to reward the proud doer. But he also knows how to reward his followers. I'd like to turn to Job. As I think of a man of putting treasures, and we're not going to get through Job. It's a fascinating book. Read it in the NLT or read it in a couple different translations. It's a very familiar story. We know how it started. In chapter 1 in the NLT, the house collapsed and all your children are dead, and I am only one who escaped to tell you. I just couldn't imagine that. You talking about putting, laying up treasures in heaven. And we know the ending of Job. Me and my wife, did you ever get into an argument and both your wife argue and you actually feel good about the argument when you're done? Which was kind of down this line. It started out, could we be like Job if God took all our children? And then it ended up, so basically his children were replaceable. Like God just, gave him 7 more children. It almost seems like God's like phooey, so what? Who cares about your first set of children? And then it got to argument about me, like, am I replaceable or is she replaceable? We started really arguing about that. And by the time we were done, we really felt good about it. So anyways, that's where that went. But as you look at Job and his 3 friends and how it says in chapter 2, it says in verse 13, it says, then they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights. No one said a word to Job, for they saw his suffering was too great for words. And that's a lot of times how our treasures are revealed, is through suffering, is through hard times. Maybe we get hurt by something or whatever. Could be our parents, could be the church, could be life in general. It usually tells us through that time is the time of navigating of where our treasures are. And basically from chapter 3 to all the way to chapter all the way to like the end of chapter 37 is the dialogue between Job's three friends. And so basically, in a nutshell, Job's three friends is someone sinned, your children have sinned. And one of them said, "My experience shows that those who plant trouble and cultivate evil will reap a harvest." Basically, that was the theme of what his three friends were telling him. And then there was his three friends, and there was a fourth one that jumps in at the end. He was a younger man, and he thought he would have the wisdom, but his wisdom was coming from anger of what the three friends weren't telling Job, but he kind of just repeated the same thing to Job, and a lot of what Job said, like I just had to put myself in the picture. If I would have been there, I think I would have been kind of a little upset at Job's friends. Job, there's a lot of chapters, his friends will talk and then he'll respond back, why was I born? It's just, interesting. One thing he says is that I am innocent, but it makes no difference to me. I despise my life, innocent or wickedness. It is all the same to God. That is why I say he destroyeth both the blameless and the wicked. And one thing that in chapter 10 that caught my attention, what Job says, your real motive, he's talking to God out of his anguish. And you think of Job and what all he lost. Is pretty incredible. Like he had a right, I want to be careful how I say this, but he had a right to complain what he did. And that's why I encourage you to read it and to really get what his three friends were saying to him and where his three friends' advice was coming from. Basically, his three friends' advice was coming from that he sinned and did everything wrong. And they were like trying to get one over him. But Job was literally saying how it was and how he felt. Job 10 verse 13, he was talking to God. Your real motive, your true intent was to watch me, was to bring this thing on. This is the way Job was really feeling. And if I sinned, you would not forgive my guilt. If I'm guilty, too bad for me. And even if I'm innocent, I can't hold my head high because I am filled with shame and misery. It just goes to show you what his view or what his thing of God was. And another thing that caught my attention as you go through that, Job calls his three friends windbags. They're nothing but a bunch of windbags. And in chapter 19 it says, how long will you torture me? How long will you crush me with your words? You have already insulted me 10 times. You should be ashamed of treating me so badly. Even if I sinned, that's my concern, not yours. You think you're better than I. And in verse 21, he gives them a little clue. It says, listen to me closely what I'm saying. That is one consolation you can give me. Job felt like his three friends weren't listening to him. He's like, that's one thing you could at least do is just listening to me. They came back with answers. We're going to jump in chapter 38 is when God starts speaking. And it's kind of hard to make all sense of that. But he asked him 77 questions. God asked Job 77 questions. And then in chapter 40 it says, Job I'm going to read it in the NLT. It said, Job responds to the Lord. Then Job replied to the Lord, I am nothing. How can I ever find the answers? I will cover my mouth with my hand. I have said too much already. I have nothing more to say. Then God continually, the end of chapter 40, 41, then 42, Job replies to God again. He says, I know that you can do anything. No one can stop you. You ask, who is that question my wisdom with such ignorance? It is I. I was talking about things I knew nothing about, things far too wonderful for me. You said, listen, and I will speak. I have some questions for you, and you must answer them. And I had only heard about you before, but now I have seen you with mine own eyes. I take back everything I said. I sit in dust and ashes to show my repentance. I had to think of that Wednesday night, the singing group, one of them shared a testimony. You know, so many of us, we grow up in Christian homes. We know God, but yet we don't know God. Like, how can that be? And here Job talks about that. I had only heard about you before, but now I see you with mine own eyes. We see the hard things that God took Job through and came out on the other side, seeing things that probably nobody ever experienced. Nobody ever will see the depth of what Job's seen and felt. Then it goes on to say, so kind of why we can say about Job's three friends. In the NLT in verse 7 it says, after the Lord had finished speaking to Job, he said to Eliphaz the Tanamite, I am angry with you and your two friends, for you have not spoken accurately about me, as my servant Job has. So take 7 bulls and 7 rams and go to my servant Job and offer a burnt offering for yourselves. My servant Job will pray for you, and I will accept his prayer on your behalf. I will not treat you as you deserve, for you have not spoken accurately about me as my servant Job has. So we know what Job said, and we know what his 3 friends, and we know what God says here. Job, his 3 friends did not speak accurately about God, but Job did. That's interesting. So it goes on to say how God blessed him, doubled his things. But that's just an encouragement I want to leave with each one of you, that God is a God of rewards. And when we lay up treasures in heaven, it'll be worth it all. Just a couple of closing verses in Romans 8, verse 18. For I consider that the suffering of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory that is to be revealed to us. In 1 Corinthians 15, 58, therefore, my beloved, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that in the Lord your labor is not in vain. So with these thoughts, let's kneel for prayer. Dear God, I thank you for your kindness. Thank you for your great love. I just pray for Miranda right now, whatever the situation is, God, just have your way in that. Comfort, give the people wisdom and strength. Thank you for your word. Just dismiss us with your blessing.